Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Welcome. So my name is Jeff Schlatter. I'm the director of the UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center. To learn more about TURC, the research we conduct here and around the world, the public education and citizen science programs we provide for the community, and our work with government agencies in the Tahoe Basin and beyond, please visit our website, tahoe.ucdavis.edu. You can also find out how to follow us on social media and how you can participate in our activities and help support our activities, including these monthly lectures. One of the goals of these seminars is to facilitate dialogue and discussion. We'll be addressing questions you may have or comments at the conclusion of today's presentation via the Q&A function on Zoom. Please don't wait to verbally give your question. We'd like to have you type it in, and then our speaker would be very happy to answer it. Before I introduce today's speaker, I wanted to alert you to some coming events. So February 17th, we have another seminar. This one will be Environmental, Social, and Economic Resilience Go Hand in Hand, the goal of Envision Tahoe. That's from the Tahoe Prosperity Center. And on April 14th, we have a presentation on the Living Snow Project. And for those of you who are feeling housebound and feel like you really have to blow off some energy and some steam, the opportunity to do that is rapidly approaching. In June of this year, we have our second circumnavigation of Lake Tahoe by kayak, Cirque 2. So stay tuned for details on that. So yesterday, I managed to dig out my barbecue under the remnants of the snowstorms from the end of December and early January. And I guess while we're all dealing with that snow, it's hard to remember that just a few months ago, our minds were totally obsessed with these unprecedented, uncontrolled, severe wildfires that were raging through this region. Although the ground's covered by snow now, the impact of those fires and the future fires will have on soils has yet to be realized. What impacts this will have on streams, the lakes, regrowth of the forest are all questions that many of us are asking. So the person who is going to answer at least some of those questions is our guest today. So Randy Dahlgren is a professor emeritus of soil science and biogeochemistry in the Department of Land, Air, and Water Resources at UC Davis. His principal research interest is in watershed-scale biogeochemistry, including interactions of hydrological, geochemical, and biological processes in regulating groundwater and surface water chemistry. I've known Randy for a very long time. Probably, I think he was one of the first people I met when I joined the faculty at UC Davis. And he's done a lot. He's done tremendous work. But one of the things he received some fame and notoriety for early on was quantifying the emissions of greenhouse gas methane from cows via flatulence. So this is now widely recognized and acknowledged as a significant greenhouse gas contributor, but Randy had first wind of it. So Randy, with that, a big virtual welcome to TURC, and the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeff. And it's a pleasure to be here today and talk about some of my research interest in fire biogeochemistry. So if you live in the Western United States, it seems like the breaking news almost every night during the summer and fall season is another fire is threatening our life and our infrastructure. And this is certainly a common theme in California in the past decade, and it is becoming more and more so as we go. But much less public attention has been focused on threats of wildfires on our soil and water resources. Yet our lives depend critically on both the soil and water resources. So the intro slide here shows a picture of the 2013 Rim Fire near Yosemite. It was about 250,000 acres. And at the time, it was one of the largest fires that had taken place historically in California. But in the last 2 years, we have had individual fires exceed 1 million acres in size. So this was just a small fire in retrospect. So fires are not just associated with Western United States and California. Approximately 1 billion acres of wildlands burn each year on a global scale. That's 3% of the global Earth surface burning. Now, many areas, such as the Amazon here, are due to deforestation and conversion of the forest into agricultural lands. Some of the other areas here are just, such as Mexico, are just typical agricultural practices, which incorporate fire into their management regime. But more importantly these days is that we're getting many more fires in the northern latitudes, which happen to be warming twice as quickly as the rest of the Earth. And areas like Siberia now are experiencing huge fires and massive alterations of our landscapes. So this is also true in California. This diagram here goes back to the year 2000. It shows the acreage burned as well as the CO2 emissions that we are experiencing. And if we look at the acres burned, they sort of wax and wane, and that's largely due to the drought cycles we experience. But we see a huge increase here to 4.2 million acres in 2020. And obviously this is a record, and it is represents 4% of the total land area of California. Last year was a bit better, came in at 2.6 million acres, but still very high from a historical perspective. Now, if we look at CO2 emissions, which are potentially contributing to our global warming scenario, they are sort of proportional to the land area burned. And in 2020, we had about 112 million tons of CO2 emissions. And in total, anthropogenic emissions in California are 350 million. So wildfires added about 1/3 to our total emissions. And that number of 112 also corresponds to almost all of the passenger car transport within California. So it is a huge contributor on these big fire years. So how did we get here? Well, if you go back and read John Muir's book, My First Summer in the Sierra, he walked from San Francisco to Yosemite, and he describes the landscapes that he was crossing. And what he found back then were a park-like setting with a number of big trees, 50 to 60 per acre, and very few small trees, open canopy. Today, if you did that same walk, you would see these closed canopy forests with more than 350 trees per acre. How do we get there? Well, this is largely due to fire suppression and the periodic burning, which was also facilitated by the Native Americans, tends to kill a lot of these small trees here and prevents them from growing up and filling the canopy and making these dense forests. So the dense forests lead to unhealthy forests and very high fuel loads. The dense forests suffer from water, nutrient, and light competition, which weakens them and makes them susceptible to disease and insect damage. And that ultimately can lead to their death. And this picture here is of the Southern Sierra near Fresno area, where between the years of 2010 and 2019, about 150 million trees died. And this was the result of the long-term drought we experienced. Trees can handle 1 or 2 years of drought, but once it gets prolonged beyond that, it just totally weakens them. And in this case here, these pine trees have succumbed to bark beetle. And now this is fuel for the next fire that gets ignited in the area. A warmer world is leading to longer, hotter, and drier summers in California. And this diagram here is showing the modeled results for the area burned from 1985 to recently here. And if we look just at the end here, we see that the projections are that the climate change has contributed basically 100% to the natural fire regime. We have twice as many fires projected here as would have occurred naturally. So why is this? Well, it has to do with the shorter snowpack season. The snowpack is a key regulator of the upcoming fire season in the Sierra Nevada. Historically, the fire season extended from about June to October. Now it's very commonly extends to May to November. So we have these long, hot, dry summers, which stress the vegetation, dries out the humidity, and makes them just like a kinder for the next fire to ignite them. So in summarizing wildfire trends in California today versus the 1970s, the frequency has increased about fourfold. The area burned, or the size of the fires, has increased sixfold, and the intensity of the fires and how much damage they do to the forest is increasing dramatically, much hotter fires. And as I previously stated, the fire season now is about 80 days longer than it was back in the 1970s, creating much more opportunity for fire to occur during our summer fall season. So what effect does that have on soils, watershed hydrology, and water quality? These are the three topics I'd like to delve into now over the next little bit. So we're going to start with soils, and I'm a biogeochemist, and my interests are looking at interactions between within and between the atmosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere, and geosphere. And all four of these spheres come together in the upper 1 to 2 meters of the soil, of the Earth's surface, which is the soil zone. So the soil is a very dynamic body. It has interactions with the climate and climate regulation. It affects the hydrosphere through regulating the quantity and quality of water quality. It affects the biosphere productivity. So it is very important that we maintain healthy soils for our future. In the United States alone, we characterized about 19,000 different named soils. So we have lots of different characteristics depending on where you are, what the climate is, what the bedrock is, and such. But for a typical soil, I need to get you a little bit of information here to set the stage for what effects fire has on it. This would be a typical profile of a soil. Typical forest soil here will have an organic layer at the surface, and this is hugely important. This is the remnants of the needles and leaves and twigs. It's like a sponge at the surface of the soil, which can absorb the water and allow it to infiltrate. So it plays a hugely important protective role in forest soils. Beneath the O horizon is an A horizon, which is broken up rocks and minerals, but also enriched in organic matter, giving it this dark color. And remember, organic matter is like compost. It is nutrients that the ecosystem requires for its growth. Beneath the O and A, we typically have a B horizon, which is often called the subsoil horizon. It accumulates things like iron oxides, making it red, and clays that wash down from the upper soil. Beneath that, we have C horizon, which is considered the parent material. So the material from which the soil has formed, relatively weakly weathered with very little biological activity. And then oftentimes below that, we'll have a bedrock layer, which we term the R layer. Now, in terms of supporting the ecosystem, the nutrients and organisms are largely concentrated in the upper soil layers here, the O and A horizons, because that's where the organic matter or their food source or nutrient sources are. So the blue line here shows that most of the nutrients are in the upper part of the soil. The fungi, bacteria, which proliferate in the soil, also decrease very dramatically, largely follow that organic matter depletion in the soil. So in summary here, the upper soil horizon is very important as a nutrient source. And if we have a fire with subsequent erosion, this layer is the layer that is lost. So we're losing the most important layer, oftentimes following fire. But the lower horizons also play a major role in water and supporting water for ecosystems. And we have to remember that soils are full of life. In a handful of soil, there are literally billions of fungi, bacteria, and other soil organisms. And they also can be affected by the fire effects. So I want to take you on a little trip here to set the stage from Sacramento to Lake Tahoe and take a look at what kind of soils we might see along that path. So that next time you drive I-80 between Sacramento and Lake Tahoe, you'll have something to keep your eye on, the soils. So as we do this transect, we find that the amount of precipitation nearly triples as we go from Sacramento to Lake Tahoe, but the temperature decreases very dramatically as we go up the hill. So if we look at three different soils, oops, I'm losing it here. Three different soils as we go up the transect. Now I got to get out of this. This is what we'll ultimately see, is that down near Sacramento, we'll have maybe 1 or 2 feet of soil above that hard bedrock layer. At Lake Tahoe, we also have just a shallow soil laying on top of that R layer with lots of rocks and cobbles in it. But in the middle, you are going to see these bright red soils that are very deep, often several meters deep. And the reason for the high soil development here is the climate. In Sacramento, it's too dry. In Lake Tahoe, it's too cold. In the middle section, it's just right when it comes to the chemical weathering and soil formation. So as we go up the hill from Sacramento to Lake Tahoe, the soils get deeper and deeper. And then once we reach that middle point, they become much more shallow as we approach Lake Tahoe. Now, what is key here in the depth of the soil is that deeper soils, that subsoil, provides more water for vegetation. And in California, the most limiting resource for the growth of the forest is not nutrients or light, it is water. Water is so important because of this dry summer period of time. So if we look at the vegetation as we go up the hill, we see that it's a mirror image of the depth of the soil. The deeper the soil, the more vegetation the ecosystem can support because it contains more water. So now you have something to look at. When you go up the I-80 corridor there, look at the relationship between the soils and the vegetation. And I suspect you'll see something similar to what I'm showing you here in this graph. Okay, now that we've had a little primer on soils, let's start by looking at wildfire impact on the soils. So the characteristics of a fire are defined here in the fire triangle. The fire and its severity are a function of the fuel, which dictates the heat, and also the oxygen concentrations are important in determining what kind of fire we have, whether we have complete oxidation or these smoldering fires that form more charcoal in nature. So difference in fire then is related to that fuel load. Here on the left, we have an open canopy forest, which supports generally surface fires. Temperatures tend to reach 500 to 800 degrees above ground here, not in the soil. Whereas with a closed canopy forest, which has crown fires, the fire temperatures are much higher, 800 to 1200 degrees Celsius. So almost twice that of what we find in these open canopy type fire situations. And as you look at a burned landscape, you can look at the color of the ash material left behind on the soil as a geothermometer. When the temperatures are generally in the area of 200 to 500 degrees Celsius, the ash that's left behind has a dark color, which we often term just black ash, where when temperatures get above about 500 degrees, then we get white ash. So the temperature will affect the color of the ash, which then when we go to the landscape, we can use that as an indicator of where the fire is burned hotter. And in this instance here of this shrub tree, we see underneath the canopy where there was more accumulation of litter material, we have got white ash accumulating, where in the inner spaces that had less fuel material, it's a grayer and darker color indicating lower temperatures. So on the landscape, there is a huge mosaic of temperature differentials from cold to hot burns, just on the average of a few meters away. If we look down in the soil, we find that the temperature increase of the soil is actually quite small relative to the temperatures above ground. And that is because, number one, soils are a good insulator. They have a lot of air, which hinders the transport of heat downward in the soil. And second, the soils don't burn very much at all because there's no oxygen. The oxygen gets depleted very quickly in the soil, and that changes it from a combustion to more of a pyrolysis or smoldering fire that has different characteristics. So if we look at a temperature profile here in the upper right, this is the temperature of the soil as a function of the fuel load, how much organic matter was there to be burned. And we're looking at depths here from 2.5 centimeters to 15, so from 1 to 6 inches. And at high fuel loads, 1 inch beneath the surface, the temperatures here were getting upwards of 210 degrees, where at low fuel loads, that would only get about 100 degrees Celsius, or the boiling point of water, so still hot. If we go down 6 inches in the soil on the same amount of fuel load here, the temperature would only be about 80 degrees under a high fuel load versus 40 under a lower fuel load. Now, the box here is indicating the lethal temperature for most living biological organisms, such as the bacteria, fungi, the roots, and also the seed in the soil that can regenerate the forest. So once temperatures start to get above about 60 degrees Celsius, then we're starting to kill the living biological material. So just in summary, back here in this diagram, at the very surface here, with high fuel loads, we'll see about 200 degrees, low fuel loads 100. But once we get down to a depth of about 6 inches, then the temperature increase is not going to be nearly as much. So the direct temperature effects on soil are isolated to the upper few inches in general. Now, what it does, what the alteration to organic matter, what happens is a function of temperature from 0 to 2000 degrees Celsius here on the color diagram below. Here we have our white and black ash indicated, white ash forming at the hotter temperatures. So as we heat organic matter, both soil organic matter and the vegetation, which is burning, between 100 and 300 degrees, we start to volatilize a lot of mercury. And yes, there's a lot of mercury in vegetation. Forest fires are one of the biggest natural sources of mercury in the environment. More importantly to the soils and the ecosystem is what happens to the nitrogen. Once we get above about 200 degrees, we start volatilizing nitrogen as nitrogen gases into the atmosphere. And this nitrogen is lost from the ecosystem and not available to support the regenerating forests. So the hotter the temperature, the more volatilization of nitrogen occurs. And once we get fires above about 500 degrees, well, about 90% of the nitrogen in the burned organic matter is lost to the atmosphere and not available to that ecosystem. And as we get these hotter and hotter fires, we can even volatilize some of the other nutrients like potassium, phosphorus, and magnesium. So it's very important to note that as we increase the temperature, the impacts, the negative impacts on organic matter transformation and nutrient losses increases very rapidly. So hot fires are much worse than cooler fires. So here's sort of a summary slide then of what happens to the soils upon burning. So we talked about combustion here. So in this plume of ash or a plume from the fire we see here, there's a lot of carbon dioxide and water as part of that, but there's also a lot of nitrogen and sulfur gases that are being lost from the ecosystem. There's also a lot of particulate matter within the ash plume here. And it is that particulate matter, especially the fine particulate matter, less than about 2.5 microns, that is the largest human health impacts of fire as we breathe that into our lungs. In terms of, so what doesn't go into the atmosphere then accumulates on the soil surface as an ash bed. And that contains all the leftover nutrients, same as at the bottom of your fireplace. So in spite of 90% of the nitrogen being lost, 10% of it accumulates here in the ash layer. Much of the phosphorus, magnesium, calcium, all of these nutrients are accumulating in the ash layer as well. So it's like we have a fertilizer layer within this ash at the surface of the soil. And for regenerating plants, it helps them get a good start. But if it gets washed away, all of those nutrients can end up in our rivers and lakes where it can cause some serious problems. Also, this ash layer has a very high pH, oftentimes pH 9 to 10. So that is another attribute of the ash layer. In terms of soil heating, we talked about that previously. Once we get above about 60 degrees Celsius, it starts to cause mortality in the seed bank as well as the microbes. It kills any of the living roots that are there. And then we talked about organic matter alterations as a function of temperature. The higher the temperature, the more altered alterations we are going to see to the organic matter. Also, we have to consider deeper part of the soil, how that is affected. And that is called the wood wide web, which is the fungal internet, if you will, between trees in the forest. The tree roots in a forest are often connected to all of their neighbors through fungi. And here's a picture of the fungi mats here. The darker parts are the roots. And the trees are feeding these fungi sugars that they get from photosynthesis. And in return, these fungi are providing nutrients and extra water, and they have antibiotics, and they prevent uptake of toxic metals into the system. So it's a mutualistic symbiotic relationship between the tree and the fungi. But if we have severe fires and kill all the vegetation, well, then the fungi are going to die as well because they've lost their food source. And again, we start to kill a lot of the living materials, the bacteria and fungi at about 50 to 60 degrees. And certainly when you get up around 100 degrees, then many of these organisms are going to die. So we can look now with some of our DNA techniques and do quantitative PCR and look at bacteria and fungi response to fires. This shows some categories of different soil organisms here, and positively affected, negatively affected organisms. So following a fire, we might see the stimulation of several different bacteria to make use of the materials that are in that ash layer, where the fungal network, which requires on the trees for their carbon source, might be negatively affected. So this means that fires can affect the entire depth of the soil as well if the vegetation is killed by the fire. So the nitrogen cycle is very important in terms of nutrients. We have bacteria that fix nitrogen for the plants to utilize. That nitrogen can end up going around and cycle in the vegetation here through organic matter microbes back to the vegetation. Some of the nitrogen can be denitrified by bacteria back into the atmosphere. And fire volatilization, as we talked about, also takes a lot of that organic nitrogen and volatilizes it back to the atmosphere, and it is a loss from the system. So I'm going to take a closer look here in slow motion now of the nutrient cycle. So plants take up their nutrients from the soil solution, and then they drop their litter on that O and A horizon that we saw. The microbes convert that organic nutrient pool back into the soil solution pool, and around we go. And in a typical well-functioning forest, there's very little leaching loss or gaseous losses because the nutrients are just going back and forth between living vegetation, dead vegetation, and microbes. But when we have a fire and the vegetation dies, we break the uptake portion of this nutrient cycle. Now we still have lots of nutrients being lost from the organic matter in the soil and from that ash layer. Microbes are breaking it down and it's accumulating in the soil solution. But if there's no plants to take up the nutrients, then those nutrients in the soil solution can be leached into our surface and groundwaters, such as Lake Tahoe. And also the nitrogen that builds up can be denitrified back to the atmosphere by soil microbial components. Nitrous oxide, a potent greenhouse gas, being one of the products here of denitrification. And then that ash layer at the surface with all of its nutrients is very susceptible to soil erosion. So I want to take a little bit more look here at the soil erosion aspect. So this is a cartoon that shows a landscape with good, fair, and poor coverage of vegetation. If we have good coverage of vegetation, the water infiltrates into the soil and doesn't run off the soil. So we have little runoff, and if we have no runoff, we don't have erosion because there's no surface movement to erode the surface particles. Then if we have a condition of poor cover, which follows a fire, we have lots of runoff of water, and as water runs off, we're taking these soil particles, the best part of the soil, that surface layer, and we are transporting that to the aquatic system. So with good cover, that O horizon that I showed you previously is like a sponge. It is protecting the soil from erosion. Virtually no erosion in a well intact forest, but following a fire where we have bare soil, the potential for erosion is huge and lots of nutrients potentially lost as part of that. So here are some pictures of soil erosion in burned landscapes. And we see that here we have sediment yield over time and we have a fire. Well, following the fire, we get a huge pulse of soil erosion and eventually it'll return to background. How fast it returns to this background level depends on how fast the vegetation reestablishes following a fire. In the coast ranges of California, with the grasses that come back and with the shrubs that can sprout from their roots, it can be just a couple years. But in some of these large fires in the Sierra Nevada mountains, this window of disturbance here is going to be decades. So we could have persistent effects of erosion lasting decades from a fire. On the Rim Fire in 2013, one of the things they did in sensitive areas is they took rice straw and they actually spread it on the burned landscape here to provide soil cover and protect some of these sensitive areas. And it was relatively effective, of course, relatively expensive as well. So in summary, we have loss of nutrients following fire through volatilization and particulate matter to the atmosphere, especially volatilization of nitrogen. We can have leaching into surface and groundwaters and ultimately the lakes, and then runoff and erosion. And this is very important source of phosphorus in our aquatic ecosystems. Phosphorus is not very water soluble in soil, so it is not all that susceptible to leaching, but it is to particle transport via erosion. Also, we find a condition called hydrophobic or water repellent soils that form in a fire. So before the fire, we have all of these vegetation and leaves here and the litter from it. And the vegetation has waxy surfaces to prevent water loss from the leaves and needles, and that makes it repellent to water. But when we have a fire, these waxes volatilize, they become a vapor, and some of that vapor moves downward in the soil until it reaches a cold area where it condenses on the soil particles and makes it effectively a water repellent layer. So now, during heavy rains following a fire, the water comes down, it hits the water repellent layer, and it just builds up, it saturates that ash layer, and it causes massive erosion. And here's a picture of a debris flow following a fire in Colorado, where that surface layer of the soil has just eroded away in mass amounts. We also see increased landslide activity due to fires. The hill slope stability decreases following wildfires because the roots within the soil here act as a rebar, if you will. It reinforces, holds the soil together. But once the trees die in severe wildfires, they start to decay and they lose their strength. So the root strength reinforcement here from high to low over time following a wildfire. We see the red line here is showing the burned vegetation where the roots died. So the strength is decreasing dramatically. Then the blue line is showing the revegetating plants. They are adding new roots to the system, and eventually they will strengthen the soil. But there's this period of time here, which in California is often about 8 to 12 years, where we have maximum susceptibility to landslide activity. And here's a picture from Highway 50 following one of the fires back in the late 1980s, where the landslide basically dammed here the South Fork of the American River, caused a little lake to form here. Eventually, it breached the material here, causing a little flood, but taking a whole lot of debris with it. So we can have surface soil erosion, we can have these hydrophobic soils, and we can have landslide activities following our fires. So another aspect that's very important to consider is that severe fires kill the seeds. Once the temperatures start getting above about 60 degrees in the soil, if there are seeds in the soil, those seeds will be killed. And as tree seeds are often, like pines, are often quite large, they can't move very far from their mother tree. So oftentimes, in large burned areas, it's the light weedy or shrubby species that come in first because their seeds are lighter, and then they get established and take up all the water and sunlight, and it really hinders the formation of the revegetation of the tree species. So in a warmer, drier climate, this is going to become even more of an issue. So envision this. The forest regeneration following a wildfire. Here, the green is the forest, the area, and the red is the fire area. If we have a small fire here, within a few years, the seeds from the natural forest surrounding it will come in and revegetate it. However, if we have a huge fire, it is going to take a long time for the seeds to travel from the intact forest to the center of this revegetating area. So we're talking years for reforestation and small fires to decades when it comes to reforestation of large fires, unless it is assisted by humans, such as planting. And finally, looking at the nitrogen cycle, as I mentioned, up to 90% of the nitrogen in the above ground vegetation and soils can be lost due to volatilization following these big fires. But following the fires, we get plants that come in, such as our lupin and ceanothus, that are nitrogen fixers. They can take nitrogen gas from the atmosphere and make it into ammonia form here, which plants can utilize for their vegetation. And they have relationships here, the Ceanothus. This is actinomycete, a type of soil organism where the Ceanothus is giving sugars to the actinomycetes, and in return, the actinomycetes are fixing nitrogen back for the Ceanothus. And the rates of nitrogen fixation are relatively high, and within about 10, 15 years, these Ceanothus can recover much of the nitrogen loss from a wildfire event. Okay, well, that's sort of an overview of some of the impacts on the soil. Let's take a quick look here at watershed hydrology, so the flow of water in the system. And when we look at the water cycle here, the rain comes down. Some of it is transpired back to the atmosphere, taken up by the roots and lost through the foliage, through the stomates. Some is lost to evaporation from the surface, and what's not lost back to the atmosphere makes it to the rivers and streams and onto our lakes and ocean. So once the water gets to the soil surface, it has two choices. It can run off, or it can infiltrate into the soil and become groundwater. So in the case here of a highly severely burned watershed, which of these two choices, runoff or infiltration, is going to happen? You got it, runoff. In the case of this nice O horizon here at the surface of the soil, it is going to promote infiltration. It acts like a sponge, takes up water when it's raining, releases it after the water rainfall has stopped. So I want to take a look at what happens to stream flow now. And this diagram here is showing the stream flow in a river over a storm event, over a period of a few days, if you will. So here we have a large storm event, and the blue line here shows a natural forested watershed. Well, the stream goes up very slowly as water is infiltrated into the soil through that O horizon and slowly released as groundwater. But in contrast, in the burned watershed with no O horizon, we get surface runoff. And that results in much higher peak flows and much faster time to peak flow, a much shorter time to peak flow. And as a result of this, we get more and more floods after these forest disturbances, like a forest fire. So this peak above the natural here, this is contributing to flood flows. And that is a big aspect. So we get much more runoff during a storm event and much less after the rainfall ceases. So that's what happens on a storm event scale. Now let's look more at the annual scale. So here our precipitation is coming in, and typically in a forest canopy, there is canopy interception and evaporation. So when it starts to rain and you don't have your umbrella, you go hide out under the tree, because the tree is acting as your umbrella, at least for a certain period of time. It takes up and holds a lot of water, and that gets evaporated right back to the atmosphere, never makes it to the ground surface. Similarly, the plant roots are extracting water from the soil and transpiring it back to the atmosphere. These are two big players in the watershed scale water balance. So when we lose vegetation, we decrease canopy interception, we decrease transpiration, which is going to mean increased soil moisture. Okay, and canopy interception, transpiration can account for 30 to 50% of the water that falls on an ecosystem each year. So what that means is that if we get more soil water over the longer summer dry period here, we have more potential for runoff, especially from groundwater. And here are some diagrams from our colleagues at Berkeley, Maina and all. And they actually published a study in 2019 on the Cosumnes River watershed, which is where the Caldor fire burned this year. So this year they're out there, I'm sure, collecting proof of concept for their modeling activities here. And their modeling activities show that suggest that there's going to be more surface water runoff because there's less transpiration, less canopy interception, and also groundwater will be higher, which will support higher base flows during our dry summer months. So the water balance is going to be changed and the flow regime is going to be changed due to the fire. Also, the stream habitat is vastly altered by the forest fires. So typically we have a large amount of large woody debris that occurs in the forest. These get burned out. We have the higher flood flows coming through, which erodes a lot of the benthic material here, supporting the ecosystem within the forest. Also, you notice here, we have a lot of shade, which keeps the temperature of the water much cooler. And this is very important for our cold water trout fisheries. Once we open up the canopy, we erode the material, we let in the sunlight, and the temperatures will greatly increase. So all of that material that's eroded from the uplands get deposited somewhere lower in the watershed, and this can create a lot of havoc as well, especially if we are depositing these fine materials on top of spawning gravels for things like our salmon, where the fine materials prevents the diffusion of oxygen and kills the eggs. So the habitat of the entire watershed is changed. And then a lot of this sedimented material also goes into our reservoirs. And this decreases our reservoir capacity over time, along with transporting in nutrients and other nasty materials into the reservoir system. Okay, finally, I want to talk briefly here on the impacts on the water quality. So if we look at the water quality effects, the potential for adverse water quality effects depends on the fire size. If only 1% of a watershed burns, we're not even going to notice the difference in the watershed. But if 100% of a watershed burns, it is going to be a severe impact. There's no dilution coming from a non-disturbed portion of it. So the bigger the size, the worse the potential disaster could be. It also depends on fire intensity. So as we kill vegetation and lose soil cover, you'll note that we lose a lot of volatile nutrients. We also have a lot of potential for soil erosion following these fires. And then when we incorporate urban areas in, urban areas have impervious surfaces. They also provide a lot of pollutant sources that are not found in nature. So these three things are very important in the potential for adverse effects. Now, the realized water quality impacts are modulated by the post-fire weather conditions. So the amount of precipitation, the more precipitation, the more potential we have for leaching and erosion. The timing of the precipitation, early season precipitation tends to cause more problem than late season precipitation. And then snow versus rain. Snow is not very erosive. It melts very slowly. Rainfall is very erosive because it impacts the surface of the soil and can cause immediate transport of eroded materials. So a quick example here, the Angora fire occurred in South Lake Tahoe area in June of 2007. Some slides here from my friend Hugh Safford shows the untreated area here in the Angora watershed where we had severe burns, killed almost all the vegetation. Then next to the urban area below here, there was a treated area where you can see that the fire intensity was not nearly as much, and there was even some living trees here. Taking a look from the surface here, the untreated condition is mostly white ash here with dead trees, where in the fuel reduction thinned area, we had much higher survival rates of our vegetation. So we looked at water quality for 2 years following the fire. Here's Fallen Leaf Lake. Here's the Angora Lakes. We looked at an area below the forested area. We looked at a site number 3, which was below the urban area, and site number 4, which was below a wet meadow. And we looked at this for 2 years in 2008 and 2009. 2008 was a relatively dry year compared to 2009. We find that coming out of the forest, there was appreciable amount of nitrogen moving, but it basically doubled by the time it went through this small area of the urban zone, but then it decreased again as it passed through the meadow area. In the wet year that followed, we saw sort of the same trend for nitrogen. Phosphorus showed a little different trend. The first year, which was dry, did not generate a lot of erosion. So the sediment load, the phosphorus load was relatively not so dramatic, so to speak, but it did drop off into the wet meadow. But in the second year, 2009, the wet year, we had much more erosion and much more transport of phosphorus. So how much water, whether it falls as snow or rain, makes a big difference. And similarly here for the sediment, it largely mimics the phosphorus data, where we had lower concentrations in 2008, the dry year, than in the following year, the wet year, with big drop-offs after the water moved through the wet meadow. So here's a picture of that wet meadow. And if you go back historically, Lake Tahoe was ringed by wetlands, and all of these wetlands act as water purifiers, intercepting a lot of the pollutants before the pollutants were able to be transported from the forest into the lake. So when we talk about wetland or meadow restoration, it plays a very big role in water quality. From the Lake Tahoe perspective of lake clarity, the fine sediments from soil erosion are a huge aspect here, as well as increased nutrients, the nitrogen and phosphorus coming from the, that will stimulate algal growth. So if we get large areas of the watershed burned, as well as very severe burning conditions, then both erosion and nutrient transport will be higher. Fortunately, from the Caldor fire perspective, the Upper Truckee River watershed, just a small portion of it burned, and much of it burned relatively at a less severe intensity. So I expect that the realized impacts will not be too large. But then if we have lots of excess nitrogen and phosphorus being imported in the rivers and lakes, once it gets into a reservoir, it can cause eutrophication and low dissolved oxygen, and also harmful algal blooms. Not so much of a problem in rivers because the residence time of water is just a few days, but once these nutrients get into a reservoir system, they can be utilized over periods of months and cause much larger problems. From a drinking water perspective, the turbidity or the sediments is a major problem. The water purveyors need to coagulate and remove these sediments. Also, the sediments can affect the taste and odor. So the thing we learned was that the first few storm events following a fire caused large amounts of sediment transport, but then the sediment loads decreased very dramatically later in the season. So it's sort of a short-term problem for most water purveyors. There's also a lot of dissolved organic matter that is leached out of the burned areas. This kind of tea-colored material you might see when leaves get leached. Well, when you react dissolved organic matter with chlorine in the disinfection of water, you can form disinfectant byproducts such as chloroform, which are known carcinogens. We also found in the coast ranges of California, near Lake Berryessa, here showing the rag fire, that lots of mercury was transported from the watershed into the rivers following the fire, much of it associated with the sediment pool. The rag fire consumed 100% of the vegetation area within the watershed, and you can see large amounts of sediments here. To the north in Cache Creek, the Rocky Fire consumed 20% of the watershed, so much lower concentrations of sediments and mercury here. And then in our reference watershed, which was non-burned, we found virtually no sediments there. So again, the extent of the watershed that burns is a big factor in controlling the water quality impacts. In the urban environment, we have impervious surfaces, we have pollutant sources that are not natural. Some of the concerns are sediments, heavy metals, mercury, and nutrients, which are also similar for natural forested areas. But in addition, we get lots of toxic potential organics, polycyclical aromatic hydrocarbons, benzenes, PCBs, numerous electronic and plastic pollutants, oil and grease, pesticides, pharmaceuticals that might be within the household here. And these pollutant sources are highly mobilized because of the impervious surface associated with urban areas. And with that, a few final thoughts. First, wildfires are inevitable in arid and semi-arid wildlands. We are going to have to learn to live with them and manage it to the extent possible. Climate change is adversely impacting wildfire dynamics at a global scale, and we are seeing the impacts already in California. Reducing the intensity and size of wildfires is a key to protecting our soil and water resources. And in fact, we have the management tools to do this, but we're 30 years behind in getting started on this massive project. In California, forest recovery following wildfires is becoming progressively more and more difficult to get plants to come back with these long, hot, dry summers. Is going to be very difficult. And many of our forests might convert to brushlands or grasslands. Finally, forest management can greatly reduce the potential threats to humans, infrastructure, and nature, but it is a long-term project. But to leave you with a happier note, this is the circle of forest life here in Yellowstone National Park from back in the 80s. It has gone through the whole transition and now is back to another forest again. So life does recover if left alone as well. And with that, thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. So we have some questions for you, and it's getting close to 1 o'clock, but it looks like we've got about 5 open questions. From Tom, should the runoff water be treated or filtered before drinking? Is it harmful for humans or just discolored and not so tasty?
In terms of chemical toxicities, if it had gone through an urban area, I would be very concerned and I would not drink it. If it's coming off of a natural forest, I believe all you need to do is largely filter it. And in terms of the chemical pollutants, it would probably be safe to drink. But I would stay away from anything that could be affected by urban area.
Great. And the people who are putting questions in the chat, if you could use the Q&A, it just gets really confusing to have them in both places. Another question from Ellen is, how do fire retardants affect water quality?
I don't know the details there, but a lot of these fire retardants do contain nitrogen and phosphorus compounds. So when they're starting to dump tons and tons and tons of these retardants on, it is adding some nutrients for sure into the ecosystem, which could subsequently get into our rivers and lakes and groundwaters. However, the amount they're adding is pretty negligible compared to the amount that is remaining in the existing burned forest. As far as some of the other proprietary compounds that might be found in these fire retardants, I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, a question from Harry about comment on the risks caused by clear cutting, even aged management compared to selective logging.
Yeah, I view clear cutting effects very similar to fire effects. It basically removes the vegetation, which reduces the cover, making things susceptible to erosion. You remove the canopy, that affects the below ground communities, the fungal web, as I mentioned there, and bacteria. So there are some commonalities between clear cutting and fire effects. Certainly, if you do selective logging and you're just removing a small percentage of the forest trees, and in particular, maybe the smaller ones that are contributing the most fire fuels and ladder fuels, as you do selective logging at a small scale, the effects on the overall ecosystem and loss of nutrients and the loss of soil cover can be minimized. It's sort of like having a prescribed fire. Prescribed fire is sort of similar analogy to that of selective logging, where a crown fire is like clear cutting. So I think there are commonalities between forest management, just forest disturbance of fire and harvest activities. So yeah, they both are disturbing the landscape, but the less you remove trees, whether it be by harvest or by fire, the less impacts to the ecosystem and to water quality.
Great. Aaron has an interesting question about the waxy water resistant compounds. How far, do you know how far those waxy resistant, water resistant compounds from leaves travel in the atmosphere? And to what extent can they and other compounds affect downwind landscapes?
I truly don't have any knowledge of what goes on there, but typically in the fire, once the fire gets hot enough, those waxy compounds in the above ground where the temperatures are like 500 to 1200 degrees, they are going to be combusted to carbon dioxide. So I don't think a lot of those waxy materials are going to survive to get into the atmosphere and be transported downwind. That's my hunch. The reason they accumulate in the soil is because we have a much lower temperature there, just enough to volatilize them, but not totally decompose them. And then as these vaporized waxes move downward into the soil where it's cooler, then they condense like candle wax and form this water resistant layer. So I suspect the waxy materials are more consumed versus being transported by the fire.
Great. So I'm going to send you this question separately via email. I had a couple thank you and a couple notes that are separate for you, which I'll send you via email. But Virginia is asking that, saying that the research and practical lessons being learned is so dynamic right now. Can you provide a couple of key agency and academic links? So as new information becomes vetted and peer reviewed. So there's people working in this field that are looking for more resources. So,
yeah.
Okay.
There is getting to be so much information out there on fire effects now from the global scale. And the research that I've been involved with, from Angora fire to the Rim fire to the Rag and Rocky fires in the Coast Range, we have fully published the water quality aspects of those. And I'd be glad to share them with Heather and get them passed along to you. Thank you.
Great. For forest land to be retained after fire, are there alternative species of trees that might be planted that would be more resilient in light of climate change?
Probably there are, but do you want to have a eucalyptus forest in the Sierra Nevada mountains versus the pine forest? So there are always trade-offs of putting non-native plants there. But as the climate warms and the amount of water available to support our forests, you're going to see a shift of our forest species that are now found in low elevation to higher elevations, because a lot of these existing trees are not going to be able to regenerate, number one, or survive without enough water. So it's going to be kind of a natural progression. Oak woodlands are going to move into the transition forest, and the transition pine fir forest is going to probably move up the hill to higher elevations. So this has occurred following glacial periods of time. We see the tree line moving up and down, and the different ecotones, the separation between the different types of forest species also moves up and down in elevation to try to optimize its growing conditions. But as far as replanting with, say, non-natives, I don't know that that's going to get a lot of traction. But if times get desperate, who knows?
Robert Coates has a great question. How do you measure water repellency in the soil after a fire?
Hi, Robert. Typically, we use we put drops of water on the surface or in the subsurface and see how long it takes to infiltrate. And if it sits there if the bead of water stays for several minutes, then we can identify it as being hydrophobic. We also can change the polarity of the water, putting things like octanol in with the water in different ratios and adding these different polarities of water to the surface and see at what point, once it gets non-polar enough, this water will infiltrate. So it's basically sitting out there with a eyedropper and putting water and or these different polar, non-polar solutions on to characterize it. There is no machine that goes out there and gives you a number to the 6th decimal point. Very qualitative, if you will.
Great. Jane lives in a forested area and is getting conflicting information about whether to rake or not rake pine needles.
Yeah, well, I also faced that same issue in the Tahoe Basin there, and I asked the fire chief what his opinion was, and he told me, and I repeat what he said, is after the first year, after there's been a snowpack on top of the pine needles, it tends to compress the pine needles and has very little surface area to support a fire. So as long as you keep the taller vegetation away that could support the fire getting up and into the canopy and into your house, my preference is to maintain the needles on the soil, but making sure that they're not accumulating, say, within 5 feet of your house. Certainly you should have a buffer zone between the forest needles and your house to prevent the transport of that fire from those needles towards your house.
All right, we're getting, it's quite past 1, but there are a few more questions. So if people want to stay on for the rest of them, the need for more forest management, what is being done to increase the pace and scale of forest management activities? And what are your recommendations? Recommendations for more?
Yeah, this is sort of the same old spiel here, is that we have too many fuels in our forest. We can't do prescribed burning because prescribed fires will become ground fires because there's too much fuel there. Therefore, there needs to be some fuel reduction in the form of thinning before we can employ prescribed fires. So this is a major issue that prevents us from doing things quickly. Certainly at the urban forest interface, that's where we need to focus our attention. And when the Caldor fire was coming towards South Lake Tahoe, we were all very fearful that it was going to jump into the urban area there. But at Myers there, the forest fuel reduction work they did at least gave the firefighters a chance to defend the infrastructure, and it worked. So I think we need to make these, I think they're called halos of forest or reduced fuels around our urban areas. Another thing that I'm a sort of a proponent of is that at the larger landscape scale, we have to prevent these fires from getting million acres. So maybe we need to go and put in some fuel lines. Maybe we need to, every few miles, maybe we need to put a clear cut in to provide some defensible space at the landscape level. It's like we, right now, where we have electrical transmission lines or roads, they serve as a defensible space that people can possibly stop fires at. Maybe we need to employ more of these within the larger forests to prevent these little fires from becoming huge fires. I'm not a proponent here of clear cutting huge amounts of the forest, but maybe we need to provide corridors within our larger forests that give us a fighting chance to stop the spread of these big fires.
Yeah, so there are 2 questions here about water quality related to drinking water. Were there any observations of water quality changes in the drinking water, in the water from those who pull from the lake pre and post Angora fire? And kind of along with that is, are there any regulations that test for volatiles or semi-volatiles in the drinking water following the fire?
So with respect to Lake Tahoe, to the best of my knowledge, there was no drinking water effect. So one of the adages we have in water pollution research is the solution to pollution is dilution. And when you have a huge water body like Lake Tahoe, even if there are some toxic compounds coming into the lake, it gets very quickly diluted by that large volume of water, rendering it non-toxic. In terms of the dissolved organic matter, that tea color material that forms disinfectant byproducts, when I work with some of the water purveyors here near Davis, they are very concerned about this, and they are measuring the disinfectant byproduct concentrations within their water sources. And if it's too high, then they go to an alternative water source, assuming it's available for this temporary period. Usually the first 2 or 3 big rainstorms of a year tends to wash out this dissolved organic matter and dilute it enough that it does not become a drinking water issue. And the same is said for the sediments, which affect the taste and odor oftentimes. So yes, immediately following the fire, you probably want to, from the drinking water perspective, they have to take some pretty big precautions. But oftentimes, within a few rain events, which might be a month or more, the water quality improves to the point where the treatability for drinking is probably not much of an issue.
Great. And then just a couple comments, I put them in the chat, were that they performed post-fire erosion control on the Angora fire, hydromulch in the high severity areas. Also, they used a water drop test to understand spatial extent of water repellency and depth of water repellency. And then for those in Nevada, Nevada Division of Forestry has a lot of funding available for fuels reduction projects, and a lot of thank yous. And then firesmartbc.ca gives good advice on how to manage property and reduce fuels around your home. There's also Living with Fire for the Tahoe Basin is a great resource. And I think that about covers it.